You're listening to Investigation Insiders by Integris Intelligence.
Hello again, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Investigation Insiders. This is Farhad. I hope you are all well and safe. Joining me today for this episode are my colleague, Mike Ginch. How are you, Mike?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. And our special guest, Katherine Schweit. How are you doing today, Kate?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on. It's lovely to talk to you guys.
Yep. Well, we really appreciate you coming on. And just for context for everyone, we actually met Kate through our mutual friend and colleague, Jin Kim, and all became fast friends. And now we are here doing a podcast together. So, Katie, perhaps we could start by providing our audience with a high-level overview of your background.
Yeah, I'm a kid who came out of the Midwest and spent my early years as a journalist, so that kind of sparked my investigative self, right? And then moved from investigating as a journalist to I got licensed as an attorney, joined the prosecutor's office in Chicago. Left the prosecutor's office when I got a job offer from the FBI. I spent 20 years with the FBI as a special agent, although I love being a prosecutor. And I think all of that still leads to, I love it. It's the inquisitiveness, right, of trying to solve a problem, and that's kind of the through line in all my time. And then I think probably the most of the time in the FBI, in my 20 years, I spent in national security, and then the Sandy Hook shooting happened, and I changed direction. I was voluntold, as we like to say. I changed direction and worked exclusively on targeted violence with the White House team, then the Vice President Biden's team, and other federal agencies to say, okay, how is this targeted violence different than other kinds of violence? What can we do about it? How can we help out the American people?
Sure. I mean, it's unfortunate that we have to have teams dedicated to that, but unfortunately we do. So you mentioned the Midwest. So talk about where you grew up and how you ended up becoming an FBI agent.
Well, that's kind of a backward story. I'm from Detroit, and I grew up in Michigan, which is lovely, particularly in the fall, and the cherry trees are blooming, and they don't have quite the summers that we have here in Virginia, where I live now. But I loved being that. I love being in the Midwest, and I spent my time as a prosecutor in Chicago as an assistant state's attorney, and which was a great job. And Chicago is by far, my favorite city. But when I was working there, I had a cousin who was an FBI agent, and he was in Ann Arbor, Michigan at the time. And I had my little sister, my youngest sister, was living in Ann Arbor, and they used to have lunch all the time. And then she would call me in the old days, no phones, no text messages, and she would call me and say, "Mike thinks you should apply to the FBI. We think you should. They think you should apply to the FBI, so you should apply to the FBI." And I'd say, "I'm not really interested in the FBI." And then he'd say, "Well, you should apply to the FBI because I'm tired of him asking me to tell you to apply to the FBI." So I kind of applied to the FBI so that my cousin would quit asking my sister, so that she could say, "Yes, Kate applied to the FBI." Done and over with. And then lo and behold, the FBI called and offered me a job. So I didn't really. I felt very bad about it when I got to the FBI Academy and I found out that this was like life's goals for people, and that there were thousands and thousands of people who applied to the FBI and never got in. And so it was very much of an imposter syndrome. I was like, what am I doing here? Because this wasn't even something that I worked and worked and worked for. So it's a very backwards time for me to say, and embarrassed to say, that I just didn't really recognize the incredible agency that it is. But I did come to find that it was an incredible agency. I'm so very proud I worked there.
Our show is called Investigation Insiders, right? So one of the things we note is that people love to hear stories. They love to hear about the behind the scenes stuff. What
Mm-hmm.
do you have a moment or moments from your FBI career that really stick out?
Oh, good question. I think there's so much time that you spend pushing paper and looking things up and talking to people, and you never know what's going to end up where. But I would say probably one of the most memorable weeks that I had in the FBI. There were a couple. Of course, one was 9/11, which I'm happy to talk about. But another occurred before 9/11. I was in my office, in a small office in Wisconsin, which is where I'd been assigned. And I'm working in this small office in Wisconsin, and I get a phone call from the local sheriff, who I know, one of the sheriff's deputies. And his nickname, as you would expect in Wisconsin, his nickname was Scooter. So Scooter called me, and he said, he's like, we got a bunch of facts, and we got a bunch of stuff going on, and we don't really know what it's all about. And he begins this long story about that includes these facts. There's a woman missing. Her kids are not very cooperative. The woman is 88 years old. Her husband is blind, almost is kind of blind and almost deaf, and they sleep in separate bedrooms in their farmhouse that doesn't have locked doors. But the woman hasn't been seen for at least a day or two. But the family's not being very cooperative, and they don't really know for sure. But the woman's car was found in a field of snow, like it was March. The woman's car was found in the snow, pushed into the snow, maybe a quarter of 300 yards, into this farm field. And oh, by the way, the phone lines in the house were cut. And the more he talks, the more I'm thinking, well, clearly, Scooter, this woman was kidnapped. And he says, well, I don't really know. I said, well, what does the family say? Well, they don't really want to talk to us, and they don't really trust us. And I'm like, okay, clearly this woman was kidnapped, Scooter. So I said, I'm going to call the office, and we sent 40 agents, which was basically the whole contingency, agents and analysts that we had in our Milwaukee office, out to this place and set up a command post. In a couple of hours, we were hand walking through the field, and it was just like one crazy circumstance after another. And then while we were there, a kidnapping for ransom note came in, and it came in on the internet from an internet cafe. If you can remember those days when you wouldn't even have a computer at your house, you'd go to an internet cafe where you could sign on. And so this went on. This happened. I got the call on Monday. The woman had been taken from her house on Sunday night. I had plans. I had like vacation plans for the first time in my life the following weekend. And all I could think of was, we have to get this case solved. And which is the reality. Not very. So we applied, oh my gosh, so many resources. And this kidnapper, there was in fact a true kidnapper who would notify and say, I'm going to be watching. Nobody better be near the family. You need to bring $300,000 to this location. And then he'd call from he'd send an email from another internet cafe, and then another one, and then another one. And eventually, we were able to have a surveillance team get to these cafes, and they'd rush to the cafe, and the guy would be gone, and they'd check the cameras, and the guy would have just left. But then we'd see a plate, and eventually we find this guy on the highway, and I did not find him. I was back in the command post, and we did a felony stop on the car, which means that you surround the car on the highway with other cars until they have to slow down. They did a felony stop, and then we pushed our negotiator into a car with him, and the negotiator talked him into telling us that in fact this 88-year-old woman was still alive, and took our SWAT team to the location where this woman was being kept in a trailer, in a snowmobile trailer in March, with a propane tank burning on the edge of it. If he hadn't cracked the door, she would have been dead from the asphyxiation. And so I'm in the command post, and it's Thursday night, right? And I'm thinking, it's been a few days. We're hoping this woman's still alive. Most kidnapping victims are killed within the first 24 hours. And true kidnappings are very rare. At the time, there were maybe 6 kidnappings, true kidnappings a year, kidnappings for ransom, that the FBI would calculate. And we get to the, I'm on the radio and listening, and we hear the SWAT team. Oh, we're here. We're at the house. He says that she says she's here. She says she's here at this location. He says that she's here, and we're hearing the SWAT convey their pieces back and forth. And all right, all right, we're going in here. It's locked. We're going to knock this lock off. We're hearing all this. They knock the lock off, and inside the SWAT team leader, or the guy who went through the door first, he comes back on the radio and he says, "She's here. She's alive." She said, "What took you guys so long?" And so, best day ever to get a kidnapping victim alive. But the 88-year-old spunkiness of a woman who was being starved to death, what took you so long? What was just probably why she was still alive. She was just too stubborn to die.
She was, yeah, or she wanted to just ream you guys out for taking so long.
That's right. What took you guys so long?
Well, that's an awesome story. Can you briefly talk about some of your mentors? It's a question I started asking more recently, and it's always interesting, some of the answers that we get.
Oh, I like that question. I've never asked anybody that, because I've been a mentor, but nobody's ever asked me, who mentored you. But when I was in that Milwaukee office as a young agent, I wasn't young in years. I was young in experience with the FBI. But I was in my late 30s and I joined the FBI just before I turned 37. Because the FBI hires older. Average age in the academy is 30. And there was an agent who I worked with, National Security Matters, which is what I was working, and he was so calm, and his name was Barry Babler, and I think one of the things that I learned from him was we can't get all the answers, and every time, and I say this is like the summary of what I learned from him, because I worked with him, and I remember saying maybe 6 months into the job, am I going to understand this job? It just seems really complicated to do national security. And he said, yeah, no, you won't understand it for another 6 months. He was very practical and very calm. And the first time I went out to do an interview on an espionage subject, I asked him if he would come with me because I was nervous and you want to have somebody with you. And as we were pulling into the parking lot where we were going to do this interview of this person from the military who actually was committing espionage, he said to me, I'm not going to say a single word while we're in there. I was like, crap. But so he kind of gave me the confidence, right? Yeah. And I think that Barry did that. And I really, I love that he just, he taught me that. And I will say also during 9/11, right before 9/11, I was working as a terrorism supervisor, the acting supervisor for the state of Wisconsin in the Milwaukee office. And I was working with a guy named Dave Williams, who is retired now from the FBI and is fantastic. And I had an incident that occurred in the FBI office one night. And somebody who I ended up mentoring, who was a young employee, called me and said, this is going on and what can I do? And I, the rule in the FBI is, whoever's closest goes. Right. And so I was just like a line supervisor, and I look up the phone number for the head of my office, Dave Williams, and I call him up, sir, hey sir, I know it's midnight, but there's a problem across the street and you're the closest agent there. You need to go across the street. And he said, okay. And he got up and left. And then he called me back to report what he'd found, to close the loop. And Dave was an agent who taught me everybody's part of the solution. You do whatever, and if that means you go across the street and you're the boss, then it doesn't matter. Everybody's got to be part of the problem, part of the solution.
Right. That's awesome. Well, it really is an interesting question, and always I find it very fascinating what people respond with, and so again, you chose to go back to fairly early on, and then sometime in the middle of your career. So, and it sounds like all the things you learned still live with you today. So, we'll get into the topic of the show, but it relates to um, this situation of workplace violence and active shooters and mass shootings and all that sort of stuff. Can you take us back to your first sort of exposure to like an active shooter situation?
Yeah, definitely. I was trained, in the FBI world, an agent is an agent is an agent, which I think is pretty reflective of how the head of the office would go across the street because there was a problem.
Mhm.
So for me, I was trained to be an agent no matter what, and I worked bank robberies and espionage cases and insurance fraud, but I didn't work a lot of violence. That was not. We had people who were on task forces doing gang violence and violence that came as a result of drug violence, drug activities, and I didn't work a lot of that until the Sandy Hook massacre and the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting, which occurred in December of 2012. There were 6 women from the school and 20 children killed, and the mother of the shooter, and then the shooter was killed, or the shooter killed himself. And so all of that suddenly catapulted me into the world of active shooters because I was at the time in FBI headquarters. I had worked in field offices, both Milwaukee and Washington field office, but I was working in FBI headquarters in more of a boss role, a supervisor role, and I had I was stopped by my boss, who was an assistant director, executive assistant director, and said, "Hey, I need you to do this now." And so you just, as an agent, you just turned. And so I turned and became, what was this that I had to do? I had to go join a team at the Vice President Biden's office, Mr. Biden's office, um, that was being established to look at these kinds of shootings and see why they were happening, why they were increasing, if they were increasing, and what we could do about them in the country. And I think that I will say that I wasn't at the Sandy Hook shooting. I have since then been, I feel like every place there's been a terrible shooting. I think I've been there. I've done film documentaries at Columbine's High School and talked to everybody who's been involved in, I feel like every shooting that's happened, although that certainly isn't true because there's been hundreds that are these types of shootings.
Right.
So my first exposure out of the box was really probably the most prominent in terms of what people remember, just like Columbine is Sandy Hook.
Yeah, I mean, what an awful event, and something that everyone had to go through. Mike, do you have any follow-up questions or comments on anything Katie said?
No, I just think it's a very interesting topic, and hearing them from Kate, I think it's just something that lives with you because you could just tell by the way she speaks about it that it's a passion of hers. It's very interesting.
And that's something we should get into later in the show. So, of course, like we're recording this episode after a bunch of hoax active shooter events at schools around the country. We had the incident recently here in New York City at 345 Park. And in fact, right before we jumped on this episode, we got the news of a shooting at a school in Minnesota. So, there's a lot going on related to this topic of mass shootings. And it's really why we wanted to address it with someone like Kate, who obviously has had a lot of experience to it. So I'm going to pass the mic off to my colleague, Mike, who's going to handle the next portion of this podcast.
Excellent. Thanks, Farhad. Yeah, Kate, we got some great questions. You obviously have the knowledge of this, so I'll jump right into it. One question that always comes about is, what constitutes an active shooter situation? What makes it the active shooter title compared to, let's say, just a shooting or just another act of violence?
Yeah, a lot of times people talk about, oh, this is a mass shooting, or this is an active shooter, or this is just firearms violence. But they're very distinct things. An active shooter is when we have an individual actively engaged in killing or attempting to kill people in a crowded space. That's a federal definition. Everybody uses that definition. And really what it means is, do you have somebody who's trying to kill people? They're coming to the scene to kill people. They're not coming to rob a bank. They're not coming to do a drug deal. They're not coming to threaten their spouse over custody issues. They're coming specifically to an area to kill people. And then are they in a place where they can kill? And oftentimes they come to some place where they can kill um, almost randomly is kind of the best way to think of it. They may come into an employer because they're angry at their boss, but there are many people in that area and many casualties that are unrelated to the individual who's doing the shooting. So an individual actively engaged in killing or attempting to kill people in a crowded space. It can be in a building, it can be out of a building. It differs in that it's anticipated crime. This is a targeted violent act. It's a planned act, not like a lot of times other killings are a result of recklessness with a gun, criminal activity gone bad. This is an intentional act, specifically targeted violence to kill people.
Thanks, Kate. That's an excellent way of explaining it. So, it makes sense in regards to the definition of it. Now, what are some warning signs that could precede an active shooter event?
There are lots of warning signs. I think that's the part that probably one of the most encouraging things that we should know is that when these shootings occur, because they are planned events, we can often off-ramp the shooter before he shoots. Generally, I say most the shooters, 98%, 99% of these shooters are male who commit this kind of targeted violence. And targeted violence is an action that is on a trajectory towards violence. So a person gets an idea that they're going to commit the violent act, and then they plan and prepare for that violent act. Thus, planning and preparation is the purchasing the guns, purchasing the ammunition, getting a bulletproof vest, doing surveillance on the location. But also, if they're thinking of killing themselves, giving away their possessions. They stop oftentimes taking medication that they're on. So these individual things that I just mentioned are all signs that we can see. So even though somebody gets an idea in their head or they're under stress and they say, the way that I'm going to solve this problem is I'm going to do this shooting. I'm going to shoot up this grocery store. I'm angry at the people who practice this type of religion. I'm going to go to their place of worship and shoot them up. In order to do that act, they have to plan and prepare surveillance, gathering the things they need, buying the clothing that they want to wear and have their photos seen in, taking pictures and posting them online in their social media feed, and also talking to other people about it, what we call leakage, and talking about it. So those kinds of warning signs are there, but we have to know how to look for them. We have to know to look for them and then what to do with them when we get that information.
That's a really good point on you saying, when we have it, what do we do with it? Now, is there any type of specific training you would say that would be helpful to recognize these signs? Let's say you're just, an employee or, a manager.
Mm-hmm. There's actually, even on my website, katherineschweit.com, there's a document called, Making Prevention a Reality that has all of this information in it. It was put together not only by the FBI, but by the experts on prevention in this area, behavioral experts from throughout the world. And it's really one of the most informative pieces of information you can read. But there are the terms that you might want to look for if you're going to search for something to learn and understand the warning signs better would be this behavioral cues, behavioral threat assessments. The threat assessment teams in schools and in businesses are looking for these behavioral cues, these warning signs. And oftentimes when there's a shooting, we can articulate what those signs were.
Very, very helpful response. Thank you for that. Now, what would you say, everyone, we always say you want to be proactive rather than reactive. If you're an organization in this day and age, what are some proactive measures you would take to prevent active shooter situations?
Oh, I think that's a great question. I think research really gives us a good answer to that. And part of that is that you have to have a process in place to gather the information, to take in whatever information you get, and then do an assessment of it. That's why they call it schools. For instance, states have laws that require schools and universities to have threat assessment and threat management teams, or behavioral threat assessment and management teams, whatever they're called, some version of those words. And the concept behind those teams is that they do the same process to take information in and then do an analysis on whether or not and what the threat is. You can't really know what your threat is to your school if every single time you don't, every single time you're just making it up. The principal looks at something one time, and then the school counselor looks at something one time, and then a teacher looks at something one time, and the football coach looks at something. That doesn't give you a process. But if you take all those people, the principal, the teacher, the counselor, the football coach, you put those people together on a threat assessment team, and you do that in a company. You can do it the same way, HR, a security chief, HR, somebody else who's in this division or that division. If you bring those people together and you create a separate process that allows you to say, hey, here's what I have to bring to the table today. We got a piece of paper, we got an email threat, we got information from about an employee who's going through this terrible bankruptcy. We have a teacher who said that she has a 7th grader who isn't turning their grades in anymore and is also drawing pretty violent pictures on their homework papers. Those pieces of information can be looked at, assessed by more than one person in a strategic, consistent way. And when you have that consistent process to evaluate whether a piece of information or a bunch of information is going to lead to a threat, that's how we get there. And also that group of people, I'll just add, that group of people can proactively look towards, okay, what else do we need to find out about this 7th grader? Let's go talk to his mom. Let's go talk to his English teacher. Let's talk to his coach at the basketball team. And then they find out that, the 7th grader is under duress. His parents are getting a divorce, or there's an abuse situation going on in the house. The more that you gather that information ahead of time, and then you can provide and build support to take care of the people who are under stress, because that's really the key. If you're under stress, you're going to act out. The more you can build positions and processes in place to help people who may be under stress, the more proactive you can be about avoiding targeted violence.
I agree 100%. It's, follow the process. And to your point, also having that team that can help, take those measures and, follow the process from there. Another really good question that comes up quite often that I'd love to get your input on is, we're now in 2025, technology, AI. What role is that playing with active shooter, mass shootings, for any preventative measures?
That's a good question too, because it's we don't always have a good way to say, how do we gather all the information? Because there's so much information. Years and years ago, we didn't have an internet, we didn't have cell phones, we didn't have social media sites, and we had kids, who wrote on paper, employees who didn't do their jobs. An employee not doing their job, their work performance decreasing, is absolutely, according to our behavioral experts at Quantico, one of the signs that somebody's on a trajectory that might lead to violence. You're not doing your job, you're not showing up for work, you're not coming to school, your work quality is reducing, and your communication skills are going down. A disintegration of your communication skills with people is absolutely a very key sign that you are on a trajectory potentially towards violence. But technology gets us the other steps. It gets us further because I can't, as a school principal or as an HR executive, find out every single thing about everyone. And I think that a good example of this is the FBI itself, right? And we, after 9/11, we built in what we would call tripwires to places. So we would say, hey, if certain words are being used, or certain steps are being taken by someone, and we can find that in the case of what I mentioned about the FBI, high purchasers of bomb making materials. Even though fertilizer is used in farms, some farmers buy fertilizer. People who are blowing up, buildings also buy it, and they're not really farmers. We find those tripwires, or we can find that. It's the same way for targeted violence. We want technology to give us the opportunity to look for more information that we couldn't possibly find, because technology is so much faster. I do a search, you type into the search engine, Katherine Schweit, active shooter, and immediately you get 1,000 things that you can search to. And we can do that now when we're concerned about somebody, and we couldn't do that before. And not just, on an open source, but also in closed sources and sources that we have access to.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Technology, you can't just solely rely on it. We still always have to go back to the human factor, and I think that combination is definitely, crucial in helping combat these type of events. Now, I want to lead into the ending of this episode on a more positive note, because unfortunately, mass shootings, school shootings, active shooters are not very happy discussions, very emotional. We only tend to hear in the news when there is an incident. Oh, there's an active shooter, multiple people have been killed or injured. But I know for a fact, in regards to the NYPD, the FBI, they have prevented many active shooter situations. Do you have a story you can share where preventative measures helped combat that and save lives?
Yeah, you know what? I do. I'm glad you asked me that. And I will say that there is a database that didn't exist before that probably most people don't know about. It's called avertedschoolviolence.org. So it's just one particular one where they talk about violence. But there are other databases that talk about shootings that didn't happen, incidents that didn't happen. Let me give you an example. Last year, when I was working, I do a podcast. It's called Stop the Killing, with my co-podcaster in London, Sarah Ferris. And Sarah and I always kind of struggle with, podcasts take a lot of time, and, we don't have any, it's just like money out the window. There's nobody sponsoring our podcast. We just do it because we think we should. And I think we're on our 5th season, and 6th season we're recording now. And last year I was saying to Sarah, hey, maybe we should, we've got 200 episodes in the can. Maybe this is enough, and maybe we should stop. And she sent me a note like a week later. It was like, magic, falling from heaven. She sent me a note a week later. She said, look at the message I just got. And it was from a middle school, U.S. middle school vice principal. And she said, I want to tell you, I listen to your podcast religiously, and I make my staff listen to your podcast. And so we knew what to do when we got some information, and we were recently able to stop a shooting in our school. And we want to thank you for the work that you're doing on your podcast. And that was very humbling, that she would even credit us with anything, because obviously whatever they did. But I was, of course, as you would expect, very curious. And so we asked her to come on the podcast, which she did last season. I said, can you tell us what happened? And she said, we were talking about warning signs. Earlier you asked me about warning signs, Mike. Well, she said, and we talk about warning signs on our podcast a lot, and different things. And she said, we had a young sixth grade boy, so he was 12, right? And he had been sitting in the cafeteria talking to 3 of his buddies, and a female classmate walked by, and she heard him talking about what she thought was shooting up the school the following week. And she was afraid, as you would imagine, but brave, because she told her mother. She went home from school. She told her mom, and her mom immediately called the school, and the school immediately called their school resource officer and the police, got the police engaged. And it turns out that this 12-year-old had been planning to shoot his school up for more than 2 years and been telling his buddies about it for months, and nobody had said anything. Months. And when they went to his house, his parents they asked, as we always do, can we go search his room? And they went to his bedroom, and they opened up his desk drawer where he was doing his sixth grade math every night. And his center of his desk drawer, there was a drawing of the school with X's and locations and names of people that he intended to shoot and kill.
Wow.
And he had the gun, he had the access, he'd already secreted it in his room. So they stopped a school shooting because they knew what to look for.
That's an incredible story, and I'm glad we're able to end on that note. But it just, I know you don't do this for the fame, to be a hero, but I'm sure when you heard that story and then have her on the podcast just gives you, just the greatest feeling knowing that you were able to make a difference and help out. Now, Farhad, do you have any questions, comments to follow up on?
I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, and probably each of those items we could turn into an episode in and of itself. But Kate, so I have one last question for you, which is, what does it feel like to do this kind of work every day? I know the positive impact, but it's got to be difficult at times as well.
It's kind of exhausting. I mean, truthfully, I retired from the FBI at mandatory, right? I retired from the FBI in 17. And so here we are 8 years later, and I'm still fighting the same fight.
Yep.
And I don't want to. And when I get off of this call, there was a shooting today, and I already have 5 requests from major networks to do interviews, which I put off because I have other obligations like this one. And but I'll probably be, downtown in Washington in a studio tonight at 10 o'clock instead of, at home or with my partner and my friends and my, family members. So it's tiring, and I'd like to not do it anymore, but I think that there's I feel like we're turning the corner on it. I know, even though other people don't, that, and maybe that the data's going to tell us, I'm working on some data, the data's going to tell us that we've cut casualties in half in these types of incidents. And, it's not in every incident, but we are making progress. But, when you think about your company, you, who has ever listening, do you have a threat assessment team in place? Do you train active shooter training in your business? The answer to a lot of those from a lot of those companies, a lot of you listening, is going to be no. And so that's why I still do it, because, when tragedy strikes, and people are devastated, I want to be there to help if I can.
Well, thank you for the work that you do. And we are very grateful to have you as a partner and a colleague as a resource to our clients and friends and family and everyone else. And so, for everyone listening, we're going to put Kate's information in the description of the podcast. Feel free to contact her directly or reach out to us and we'll get you connected. But Kate, I can't thank you enough for joining us for this episode. And I hope people listening to this episode do reach out and do ask questions, because if you're unsure, the best thing to do is seek out help. And Kate is top tier resource for you all. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. It's great. Everybody can do something to make their environment safer. So think of that one thing that you can do. And I appreciate the time today, you guys. Take care.
Advice. And thank you, Mike, for joining us today as well. And to everyone listening, till next time. Thank you.
Don't forget to follow us. We are on LinkedIn and Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube.